Hello and welcome to Design Voices Elevated Season 2. Today we are in London meeting Sarah Gold. Hello, Sarah.
Hello.
Sarah is very pregnant, as I am. I am also very pregnant, but she's more pregnant than I am. When are you due?
Just in a couple of weeks' time.
Just in a couple of weeks' time. So this is a
Yeah.
real warrior, you guys. She's like here doing the interview regardless. So I'm really grateful for your time.
Pleasure.
And we are in your house.
We are, yeah.
This is our living room. Okay, shall we start by talking about your background? What's your story? How did you come to this point in life?
Yeah. I'm a founder and CEO of Projects by If, a design studio based here in London, but we work globally. Alongside that, I also sit on a board and I'm director of a couple of startups really looking at trust broadly in products and services. And I came into digital and looking at this theme of trust from architecture. So I originally studied architecture, and that gave me, I think, two things: a kind of broad understanding of systems as a way to create change. So I'm really interested in how we design for communities and multiple people, but also how we think about the other kind of systemic issues that we need to consider to create great things, whether that be the environment or the quality of the public space around a building, and then bringing that into digital. So thinking beyond individual user needs, to think much more about relationships, how digital products and services can facilitate that, but also how do we start to surface some of the kind of underlying systems underneath services and products, really, the technology itself.
I'm really interested in your story because you are a design founder, if you like. And I've been looking around. There are not many. I mean, there are some, but there are not many designers that choose to start their own venture. And so when did you realize that was your call?
I think there are two answers to this question. There's one which is that when I decided to move on from architecture and look at design, I ended up doing a master's in industrial design at Central St Martin's. At that point, the Snowden revelations had just come out, and I graduated with a project called the Alternet, which was this idea for like a fair trade internet.
Alternet?
Yeah, the Alternet.
Okay.
And it's a project that I think inspired a lot of people. I think it's still really relevant to the work that I do today. And that project kind of propelled me into this space of how do I start to look at the socio-technical issues within technical products and services. And I think that particular project, for me, it had a series of questions in it that I really wanted to answer. And so when I went into the workplace, I was like, where is looking at issues of like privacy or trust or digital rights where I can be paid to like look at these questions?
And you didn't find
And
one?
I didn't find anything. At that time, there was a really big emphasis on open data. And whilst I think open data is an important part of the digital ecosystem, I think we also need to be really cognizant of what happens when we think about information that's not as open and how we manage that and how we manage the technology. I think the other side of the story, and that's why I started IF, was to look at these questions. I think the other side of the story that's also true, and I think it's true of many founders, is that at the time I also needed a distraction in my life, in my personal life. And when I look back now, 8 years later, and I look back at why I started this, diving into a really complex area at work, I think helped me cope with and manage what was going on in my personal life at that time. And I think you can only look back and see that now.
Yeah.
But I think for any founder, there is a certain madness that you have to start your own thing. It's very hard.
Yeah.
And that was mine. Yeah.
Nice. Can you tell us a bit more about what IF does? Like, what do you do on a daily basis?
Can I get some water?
Yes.
Sorry, I just had she's just been kicking me in the gut. I'm really sorry. 1 second.
I'm gonna keep this one.
Oh my god, yeah.
I'm gonna keep this one in.
Oh my goodness. She's just been.
Oh. Can you tell us a bit about Projects by IF? Like, what do you do?
So Projects by IF, we are a design and strategy firm, and we specialise in what it takes to build trustworthy products and services. And we think about trust as being trustworthy products and services as helping people feel safe, empowered, and respected. And when I started IF 8 years ago, it really came from a place of questioning why it's so hard to understand how technology and information about us is used by the services that we use every day, and that creates a series of risks that at that point in time weren't really being managed. Like, the big reveal was state surveillance that Edward Snowden had made us all aware of. And when I started IF, people would say to me, why does this matter? Who cares? Or I've got nothing to hide. These were like the main conversations I'd have. Then, of course, you have the Cambridge Analytica and Facebook trust breaches. I don't know how many data breaches organisations have had now, but I mean, it's a lot. One of the most recent ones in the UK has been a cyber attack connected to a third-party service that collects information about people's blood tests from 2 hospital trusts in the UK. They're significant, they're serious, and I think that we can design our tech stack and products and services differently to make sure that these kinds of issues are minimised, but also that people understand some of the risks and trade-offs when you use digital products and services, particularly to make decisions on your behalf. But I also think that there are opportunities now, more so than ever, to really think differently about the way that we use technology, what kind of information is collected. So just last week or the week before, Apple launched their Apple Intelligence, which is a kind of AI play. And Apple have made and continue to make really big claims about privacy. What's interesting with Apple is it's not just a marketing claim. They back it up in terms of what they're building in their tech stack. And I think generally where Apple go, the industry follows. So I think this landscape of why care or why does it matter is shifting, which I'm really happy to see. And so we've been working on this field for a long time now, helping really progressive people inside organisations to think differently about how technology and data is used so that it can be more transparent, more accountable and more participatory. Yeah.
What are the sectors you work with, and how does the approach differ, if at all?
Yeah, it differs quite a lot. So started off working in big tech. So one of the first projects we ever worked on was for DeepMind Health, for a really good friend of mine, Andrew Eland. We're good friends now, which is lovely. We were working after there was a trust breach, as DeepMind Health were working with patient data from the Royal Free. So we started working in big tech through word of mouth and just doing good work. We ended up doing more work in big tech. The last few years that has shifted and diversified as I've learned and grown as a founder and realising your pipeline really matters. Diversity of that pipeline. And so as that's become more apparent and more important in the business, we've diversified into looking at more regulated sectors, so in FS, in healthcare as well.
FS, financial sector.
Financial services, and then increasingly now, AI startups. So, in government departments too. So we're actually working across a number of different industries. I think what's different, to come to your question, is And in some ways this is hard to answer succinctly because so much has changed in the last 8 years in this area. But I think we've seen the emergence of trust and safety teams or responsible AI teams inside particularly big tech. And that's for really looking at how can, and this is always as a result really of the regulatory environment shifting. So when we started working in this area, GDPR, the General Data Protection Act, General Data Protection Regulation, had just started in the UK. And that was really one of the first data protection pieces of regulation. It actually came from the EU, I should say. I'm saying the UK like we're part of the EU still, we're not, sadly. But that was an EU piece of regulation, and that really it gave people new digital rights, like the rights to be forgotten, for example. And as that regulation came in, obviously businesses had to then respond to that by having not only new governance, but also understanding more about what was happening within their tech and data stack. Now we have an awful lot more regulation and acts around not only data, but AI, competition, you name it. And so I think that has meant that there are new teams that are formed within these organisations. However, COVID and these teams began to be made redundant. So as organisations started post-COVID to then look at, essentially shareholder value, those teams began to get disbanded just at the moment as well, where I think more people waking up to the kind of risks of technology, and particularly AI as well, as we'd all been, really dependent on these tools for 2 years over COVID. So, these kinds of teams were removed in one way or another from organisations, and they're now external. So you see trust and safety startups who provide these kinds of services like content moderation back into these businesses. So that has really shifted across big tech. And then when you look at organisations who are digital but might not be big tech first, so you're looking at organisations that work across healthcare or in financial services, you then have organisations who haven't gone through that sort of shift but are trying to work out internally, where do these kinds of problems sit, who owns them? And the truth is that it's still quite messy. It's not clear because trust is such a horizontal issue. It touches so many different parts of an organisation, from marketing, product, legal, you name it. It can't really be held in one vertical. And I don't think we know what the right model is just yet. That's the truth. But I think the model that big tech took is not one that I'm seeing repeated in other industries necessarily. Some of those teams have got responsible AI teams, but what you see all the time is that product is queen, product is where decisions get made. And unless those teams have got direct influence into those product teams,
it's hard to make it.
It's really hard to make change.
What's the opportunity for designers in all of this? It sounds a very technical thing.
So I think it's a great question. I think there's so much opportunity for design. I think that partly comes from really unpacking that this area is not just a technical challenge, it's a socio-technical challenge.
What does that mean?
It means that, well, the way I think about it, so I mean, there's so many different definitions we can use, but the way that I would think about it is that technology is not neutral and it doesn't just happen. So if we think about what makes up technology, you have compute, so the power, you've got money to pay for like electricity, but also literally the chips and whatever else that happens. You generally need data. So data represents people, it's inherently social and socially constructed. So what do we decide gets recorded and what doesn't get recorded? And it requires people because you need people to design or build that piece of technology, make sure it's working well, and as we now know, also moderate the outputs, particularly when you're using automated systems. So the idea that technology is kind of like this separate thing that just happens, I think it's not accurate, because it requires people, and every part of it requires thinking about what are we trying to learn or understand or show, and that takes design. And so for me, technology is inherently socio-technical because it requires people. It's not just this kind of magic thing that happens. It's this combination of people and tech. And that socio-technical piece for designers to really understand and get into asking questions about what information are we collecting, why. We are, I think, in that design process in a really important place of being able to ask critical questions so that we can better meet people's needs, better meet organisational needs. Without design as part of that process, you come back to that classic question of what's the problem we're solving? And there's Cedric Price, an architect, he says, technology's the answer, but what was the question? And I think that's really relevant today, as much as it's ever been. And I think that's where design comes in, is, what are we trying to solve, and for who, and why? And how can we align our technology to deliver that safely in a trustworthy way?
So I'm sure you've got many designers in your team. What do they actually do?
What do they actually do? We try and have as much fun as possible. That's serious.
Sure. That's great.
We work in multidisciplinary teams as much as possible. So we do have designers in our teams, and we work alongside folks who understand engineering, policy making, content design. So we very rarely work as kind of an isolated design team. We are far more multidisciplinary in both our teams, but also the work that we look at. And I think that's really important when you address an issue like trust, because you have so many different aspects of areas like policy or regulation, society to think about. So our designers are both facilitating conversations within the team itself to help translate between engineering or developer speak and policy speak, for example. So there's a big translation and facilitation role that they play. They're also practically getting into prototypes that we take into design research. So we often will prototype early, take that into user research in order to find out where are the riskiest assumptions that we're making, where are the questions we should be asking. So we tend to use prototypes to learn and to think. We throw them away. And then as you get further into that process of production or into delivery, we will use prototypes as a way to then obviously hone in on what are we delivering, how do we deliver this. So, designers are part of that whole process of designing and researching against prototypes and provocations.
But what's the output at the end?
Yeah, so the output at the end are, one of the key outputs we produce are design patterns. Okay. So if I take you back to that project, the alternate that I spoke about, my graduation project, one of the parts of that project was something called data licenses, which is an idea I probably disagree with about 50% now. Like when you look back at your previous work,
Good, you go.
Yeah, it does, yeah. And that was really thinking about, just terms and conditions are broken. No one reads them. Few people understand them. And they also tend to not be very accurate, because the way that technology and data is used now, it changes in real time. You can't update your terms and conditions at that speed. So the idea was, how do you start to take your terms and conditions and translate that into moments in the interface of a product or service where it's much more human-centered, where someone is given these questions around consent or is made aware of how information might be used at the point they need it. And so the data licenses was really a pattern, so like a repeatable solution to a common problem in how people can say to an organisation how they're comfortable with information about them being used. And we've taken that into the work at IF. So this idea of design patterns or a design system that is really about human-centred ways of bringing in transparency, accountability and participation is a big part of our work. So that we are, we sometimes talk about seamful design at IF, but how can we expose the seams of how products and services are made? So design patterns are a big part, and I think the history of them is really interesting, particularly when you also unpick it towards architecture, which is, as I mentioned, my bachelor's, because architecture is all about patterns. So there's a pattern handbook you actually get as a student and that you would use as an architect, and it will specify the standard like width or height of a door, of a kitchen unit, and all of that has been developed vernacularly over time. So lots of different people coming together to really hone patterns. What are the repeatable solutions to what size a door frame should be?
Yeah.
So when we take that into digital, we talk about design systems, and we think that those design systems can be updated to include trust, to include these questions about how automated decisions being used, what kind of data gets collected. We call those design patterns. So we have that as an open source resource, catalog.projectsbyif.com, and that is a resource of open source patterns around trustworthiness. Other things we will literally produce and hand over will be prototypes or early stage products and services in that kind of alpha stage. Also, we will hand over research insights, sometimes strategy documents. It really depends on what we're working on and with who and what they need.
And who's the ideal user of those patterns? Like, who's on the other end to actually receive and do something with it?
Yes, those patterns, the users of those patterns tend to be product teams. So I would say that the most impact we can have in our work as IF is to work directly with those product teams who are then using those design patterns, taking them into their work. I think, and you'll know more about this than I do, design can have either a strong influence within an organisation or quite a weak one. So it really depends. If design has got that influence within product, then design might use those patterns. But we find more often than not that it's actually directly with the product teams, and it tends to be therefore a mix of like design and designers and developers, who will use those patterns. So we try and make them full stack as much as possible.
What's the one achievement that you're the most proud of in these 8 years?
I think I'm most proud of both still being here, because it's been a rocky 8 years in the world.
Yes.
Many polycrises.
Oh, wow, yeah.
And being a sole woman founder has not always been easy. And that's, on top of all of these other issues. So it's still here, still going. But I think the thing I'm most proud of is the impact that the work has had. And that's what I've always cared about most, is how are we making impact in the world? And I think that there's, what I hear from people who work with us or come work in the team is they don't think about problems in the same way anymore. Like, IF changes the way they think about things. And for me, that's wonderful, because it means you then have more people going out into the world thinking critically about technology, information, rights, trust. And I'll hear from people how they're taking that thinking or those techniques into the work they're doing. We often hear from people around the world who use the catalogue as well in their own work and thinking, or have forked it to create their own catalogues, whether that be governments or organisations privately held. So I think the thing I'm most proud of is the impact, but it's the impact that the work has in inspiring people to think differently. Obviously, we've had some real tangible business impact too, but for me personally, I really care about that piece on changing people's mindsets and helping them see what else can be possible. Because I think if you can influence more people, you'll make more change ultimately. So,
what's the reality of being a sole woman founder? You said it hasn't been easy.
I think there are lots of challenges that you come across.
In tech
that
especially. I'm interested in this in tech. It's not just any founder.
Well, I think when I think about sort of digital culture, it is still very dominated by a particular way of thinking that can be quite fixed. It can be like, technology is going to solve these problems, these challenges for us. And I know, both as a woman and as a mixed race woman, that often technology doesn't serve everyone in the way that we think it will, and it creates new problems and new challenges. And I think trying to encourage people to think more broadly about that has been, it's a privilege to be able to do that, but it also puts a lot of pressure on you. And I also think there is a challenge in doing work that is broadly about ethics. I don't tend to use that word deliberately, but I think thinking about ethics and being a woman in what tends to be a very male-dominated space can create or exacerbate, I think, the idea that, oh well, the woman's just going to do like the kind of emotional work or the softer stuff, not the real tech decisions. That's not really true. But that's been a hard and continues to be a challenging space to navigate. Like, it's not a surprise to me that most of the people who I see in this area trying to change how technology operates and works so that it can serve more people more fairly are women. So I think it's not only within tech, but it's also then when you layer this space that I work in, which is how do we change the current systems to something that is more equitable. It's this layering of you're both working in a space that is more male coded, but you're bringing a perspective that isn't always shared by everyone. It's something that you're bringing that's new, that's challenging, but can often be perceived as less valuable in some way or another. And I wish it wasn't that way, but it is.
But what do you do how do you do it? Like, how do you keep the work despite all of that? What's your secret? What's even your advice, for maybe some of the people that are in a similar situation and they're just about to give up?
I gave this advice to someone recently, actually, who wanted to know. She's an incredible designer, wants to move out of the UK to start a kind of design school in a very different environment, very different context. And she was looking for kind of business advice. And I'll say what I said to her, which is that lots of people will have lots of opinions about what you should do, what you shouldn't do, how to go about things, how to get a business plan, how to have the right team around you. But I think the most important thing for me has been to remember that I'm not my work. And I think that it's relevant no matter how you identify. I think as a woman, it's really important because you will have conversations that will be hard. You will be in conversations where you won't be heard, where you'll be dismissed, where the value that you're bringing will be under more scrutiny, perhaps, than if you were not a woman. You pick up on things, right? And I think that knowing that you are not your work, that your value sits outside of that, your purpose in life is not this business. It's one way that you can share your share what you're interested in, share your expertise. For me, it's how do you leave the world in a better place than you found it, which sounds very fluffy, but that is why I get up and do what I do. I really believe in that. But in order to keep doing it on the days that are tough, or the meetings that are difficult, or the sexism that you experience, it's really important to remember you're not your work. And whilst you're working on your business and making that happen, just make sure you have something outside of it, whether it be climbing or some kind, writing a non-fiction book, or whatever it is that you're interested in, that you know that you have something else outside that can remind you of who you are. And I think that's the way that I wish someone had said that to me at the beginning, because I was all in. And to some extent, when you start a business, you have to be all in. But that doesn't mean you can't balance it with some other stuff. And I think that's really important.
You probably have to learn yourself. Maybe probably if somebody told you that, you wouldn't have done it anyway.
Yeah, you might not have even had time.
No, exactly, to listen to this person.
Yeah. But I think that's, if is all about making change in the world. And that change is, I love being a part of it. I believe in it. I can see how it's happening. I'm also very cognizant this change is much bigger than me. It's bigger than if. It's bigger than all of us, really. And so how do you, sustain yourself on that journey?
What's next for if you think? What are you working on?
So, great question. What's next is we have been working in a really R&D space for quite a long time, which has been super fun. It's also super hard. I like doing hard things. But what we want to do is get our work into more organisations, but also the work into the hands of more teams, and those teams who are maybe earlier on in their journey in this space. And so what we are currently doing is looking at how do you get started in this space of thinking about trust, particularly when we add in generative AI models, any kind of technology really. But how do you really think about how to integrate these technologies in ways that mean you have tools that people want to adopt, want to use? So we're looking at ways, kind of work that is kind of easier for folks to get started into this space. You don't have to be, ahead of the game. How do you just start, even in organisations where there are still questions about digital transformation, or just how accurate data might be that is being held? How do you start with these issues? So what's next is helping more teams and more organisations who are earlier on in their journeys. And what we also want to do is continue really at the same time getting into this critical space of ultimately how we think services will change as a result of large language models or generative AI. Because if you talk to anyone on the team, we'll all tell you chatbots are not the future. That's not.
Did you hear that?
This technology has got some far more powerful applications of joining infrastructure together so that the experiences we have will be potentially not through multiple different organisations or apps, but through one seamless experience. And that changes all sorts of things. So at the same time as helping teams get started, we're also looking at and working on the kinds of challenges of what we've called learned services, but essentially where you have services that are one experience through multiple public or private organisations. So those are the kinds of questions that we're asking ourselves at the moment. And we want to do that while still having fun, enjoying the work, having some good crunchy challenges to work on.
Yeah. What's one fear that you have for the future?
I mean, I have lots of different fears in this space because there's a lot of harm that gets created by unintentional and sometimes intentional uses of technology. Like we can see right now, I think, with many of the large language model providers, it's like, do as I say, but don't do as I do. When you look at, for example, the way that Scarlett Johansson's voice was used without her consent for ChatGPT's Sky model, that we really lack that leadership in this space of how to do this well, because we all deserve better. But I think my biggest fear is that we end up, through not focusing on what we want and how we improve things, that we end up in a place where we are in the Black Mirror future. Because we just focus on, or end up intentionally or unintentionally, with the negative. And I think that's the biggest fear that I have, and I think where we'll end up, as ever, is in the messy middle, where the future isn't this kind of rose-tinted, perfect place. It's not going to be this super negative, Black Mirror-esque scenario. We will end up somewhere in the middle, and I want to help with the work we're doing at IF get it further towards that kind of better end. But I think the fear I have is that we don't have enough leadership in the space to really inspire people to get to what's better. And in not having that, we end up creating more harm.
Where do you think this leadership should emerge from? Like, where should it come from?
I think that leadership comes from, I think it partly comes from literally boards and leadership teams in organisations who are willing to stand for something, but also who really understand the commercial or like operational excellence that can come from thinking about trustworthy products and services as opposed to not. So whether that be about reducing your risk of regulatory fines or making products and services that are better adopted in the marketplace. So you don't have to necessarily have this like, I'm going to try and do this, you know, for the good of people. Like this actually is beneficial for organisations, whether you're a private organisation or a public organisation. But I think at the end of the day, all of the decisions that are made around how products and services are created, launched, maintained, come from people. And so I think that leadership has to come from each of us, which is, you know, what world do you want to live in? And how could the work that you're doing now help drive towards that future? We each have choices we can make, and I think that leadership has to come from each of us individually to make slightly different choices or ask different questions in the work we're doing day to day in order to kind of turn these, you know, big organisations often, but tankers in the right direction. And I think obviously that's in big organisations, but also in startups too. We can make different choices.
What would be your advice to a design leader managing and leading a team in an organisation today in respect to all of that we discussed?
Well, in particular, when I think about more and more organisations are either experimenting with or claiming to use AI technologies. Part of me sometimes thinks that AI is like a marketing term these days. But in all seriousness, it is a set of different technologies that you can use to create different outcomes in your products and services. And I do think that finding the right use cases for these is really important. It's the work of design. But I think that as designers, we need to think about these things, these kinds of technologies, differently to the way that we've thought about technologies that don't change as much over time. So with AI, you've got systems that, in particular generative models, that change over time, and the outputs of those systems are what we would call non-deterministic. You're not sure what you're going to get. And that means that your customers or users are each going to potentially see different outputs. They may or may not be more personalised. And that's quite a different way of thinking about how some services work. Now, what's interesting is lots of products and services have always been non-deterministic, or services more broadly.
Yeah.
So this isn't necessarily new thinking, but I think the application of it within interfaces that use AI is. Because previously you could be quite assured of what screen someone was going to be looking at a particular point in time. So how do we start to think about the kinds of, again, like design interface patterns that help someone understand what's happening in that moment in time, where they are supported if something looks wrong or if they think something's wrong, which is sometimes as important. So how do we really design for that non-determinism? And the other part of this is that, there is a potential future where we have more what's currently called AI agents. I'm quite sceptical about this as an idea. However, the idea of having potentially multiple different AI models operating on your behalf. And so as designers, something we need to start thinking about is how we not only design for people, but how do we also design for AI, for small computers who we're going to be interacting with, or potentially AI that interacts with AI. And so I think that if there were just a couple of thoughts to think about as in design leadership teams, it's how do we get ahead of some of these inevitable shifts that we're going to see, so that we can really prepare our design teams to think in this way, so that we're not following or copying others necessarily. We're in a position where we can lead and suggest how do those kinds of interactions or moments in design really link back to the values that we have as an organisation or as a team.
Nice. I have one last question, which is your hope for the future.
I mean, my hope for the future is that we have, and I think we're beginning to see it more and more, but that we have truly like full stack change when it comes to trust. So we are not reliant on static terms and conditions or policies or empty promises or claims that are not provable about how technology is being used, how information is being used, so that we're in a place where people are able to understand what's happening to information about them, what automated decisions are taking place, and how they can influence or affect those. So to me, it's that my hope is that, and I think this is already happening, is that trust is seen as like a real driver of change for the way that we build products and services, so that people are able to feel safe, respected and empowered by the tools that they use.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Thank you
for being with us. It's been a pleasure to hear your story. And we'll see you next time. Bye. Thank you for watching this episode. If you have enjoyed it, please share it with your network. Design Voices Elevated is a short video series aiming to provide a stage to underrepresented design leaders to inspire new reflections and conversations. My name is Marcia Arico. I'm a strategic design consultant, design leadership coach, public speaker and author. If you would like to follow my work, please subscribe to designmavericks.substack.com. See you next time.